Hi, it's Niles Parker, the Gosnell Executive Director of the Nantucket Historical Association. Before we dive into this episode about the old mill here on Nantucket, I wanted to let you know that we are currently undergoing an exciting and major restoration of the building. Over the past year, we have been peeling back the layers of the onion of this mill. We have hired two nationally renowned experts in the field of historic preservation, ICR-ICC and Husk Preservation, whose founder you will be hearing from later in this episode. With their help, we are now assessing next steps of how best to care for this beautiful building and make sure that we get all the necessary work done right so that it can continue to operate as the nation's oldest continuously operating windmill for generations to come. Thank you for your patience, and I hope your excitement on this project. We look forward to sharing our findings with you as they become available. Please check out nha.org for any updates, and I hope you enjoy this episode of the Nantucket Gam.
It's August 4th, 1897. A large crowd has gathered at the base of Nantucket's Main Street in front of George E. Moore's furniture shop. They stand in a tight clump on the sidewalk in front of what is now Murray's beverage store, trying to hear the auctioneer. For weeks now, news of this moment has been the talk of town. Nantucket's beloved old mill is up for auction. Despite the fact that the mill had not operated in half a decade and was run down, dilapidated, a creaking old building, this was still one of the most famous structures on the island. Newspaper adverts had been taken out. The town crier had made the rounds. John Francis Sophia, the old Azorian miller who had turned this building from an old, run-down relic to an island icon, had just passed away. And everyone knew, at the end of this auction, whoever the new owner would be would decide the fate of the mill. Now, standing in front of his own furniture store, the part-time auctioneer, George E. Moore, climbs onto a chair to be able to see over the large crowd. A hush slowly falls. He first pays a small tribute to the beloved mill, then prepares to start the bidding. But it quickly becomes evident that there are really only two motivated parties, an unnamed individual and the newly founded Nantucket Historical Association. The bidding starts at $550, each party raising the stakes bid by bid. Eventually, James H. Gibbs from the Historical Association shouts out, $885! The crowd and the auctioneer wait for a rebuttal. Nothing. Congratulations and handshakes erupt as the anxiety of the crowd is broken and the nascent Nantucket Historical Association is declared the victor. Dr. J. Sidney Mitchell, the president of the Nantucket Historical Association, stands up and proudly states to the crowd that the old mill would be, quote, sacredly preserved for all to enjoy, tourists and residents alike, for years to come.
Welcome to the Nantucket Gam. I'm Adam DeLogue, and I'm joined today by Thomas Parrish.
Hello.
And Annalee Gilbert-Keith.
Hi.
We are members of the Visitor Operations team at the Nantucket Historical Association. In each episode, one of us will go on a research blitz, pulling facts and stories out of the archives to explore the fascinating history of our island. Then we'll invite a guest to join our GAM to understand how the past continues to shape the modern history and future of the island. In this episode, we will dive into the Nantucket Historical Association's Old Mill, which is the oldest running mill in the United States. Later, we will be joined by Amy Boyce, who is currently working with the NHA to help restore and rebuild the mill to its former glory. I really love our old mill. As somebody who's been lucky enough to spend many a July or August day up on Mill Hill, sunny, windy, when that mill starts to shake and creak and groan, it truly transports you to a different era of Nantucket, to a different era of our country. It's been called the Old Mill as long as any of us have been alive. But Thomas, when they were referring to the mill in the 1897 auction, were they calling it the Old Mill as well?
Yeah, no, they were. Even in the newspaper, the auction was for the old mill. At this point, it's over a century and a half old.
And it had been out of use for some time?
Just for the past couple of years. It had been running more or less nonstop since it was first built in 1746. And through a series of owners, had been operating up until the mid-1800s, where it started operating more sporadically, more for show than for actual economic production.
I think that maybe for those of our listeners who haven't been inside the mill while it's running, there is a video that we have on our social media and on our website available of the mill in action. But truly, I think you have to come and visit because the sound that it makes, the smell in the air, you sort of get transported back to a time where they were relying on this giant machine to be able to produce this corn flour to feed their families. It's definitely unique.
It is, and I think you really hit it on the nose, that it is a very tactile experience. Like, all 5 of your senses are engaged just being in there, and being able to take some of the, see the flour being produced and how much can be produced is pretty incredible.
Now, Nantucketers today are more used to windmills producing electricity, but what was the reason that the old mill was originally built here on the island?
Was called a smock-style grist mill. We're going to be technical here. But essentially all that the mill did is it took wind power and used that to grind corn into cornmeal. So essentially a little bit coarser version of flour.
Part of the original sort of agricultural settlement here?
Exactly. I mean, before whaling took off, Nantucket was, even while whaling was going, was actually incredibly agricultural here on land. Many, many farms, and corn was one of the few staple crops that actually grew relatively well that year because our soil is so sandy.
And so you would have a miller who would serve the community?
Yeah, so a farmer would grow his corn, he would shuck it, and that would usually be a community event at the end of the year. You'd bring all the corn together because it's just laborious and takes forever. And so we have these great photos in our collection of these community events of people shucking. But anyway, you would shuck the corn, you would dry it, then you would take the kernels off. You would then have to take off the rough shell of each kernel, and then you would bring those kernels to the mill where they would be ground. And you would get 15/16 back of what you brought, because the miller would keep his miller's toll, which was set in Massachusetts as 1/16. And that's how he made his money, was keeping that extra bit. He would trade it, sell it, use it, and that's how he made his money.
Interesting. That was set by the state.
By the state, yeah.
Huh.
So Thomas, what were they doing with the cornmeal that was coming out of this mill?
Well, you can do a lot with cornmeal. That's why you grind it down to meal. There's only so much corn on the cob you can really eat. But if you have cornmeal, you can make corn bread, corn muffins, hasty pudding, all sorts of good stuff. I think you've cooked with cornmeal a little bit, haven't you?
I have, yeah. Some weird corn puddings and stuff.
Yeah.
Over an open hearth. It's always a little funky.
It does. Cornmeal is just, it's more diverse, and the miller could trade with it, sell it. But you could also take it aboard whale ships. And we have documentation that some of the cornmeal, I don't know for sure from this mill, but I assume from this mill, traveled aboard whale ships around the world, and you could cook with it to do some of these delicious corn puddings.
I also will add, I feel like today people, when we're cooking with cornmeal, it tends to be coarser, but you can make cornmeal at all different consistencies, and it can be more of a flour than the sort of gritty texture that we're all used to.
The grits, yeah.
The whole idea behind crushing this corn is that somebody very smart, very long time ago, figured out there are certain grooves that you can cut into your millstone to help grind certain different grains. So you would have a different groove for flour coming from wheat. You would have a different groove if for some reason you were grinding sorghum.
The great sorghum mills of Nantucket.
I thought you were going to go for I don't know, barley. Yeah.
And so there are certain grooves that you have to carve on your millstone if you want to grind corn.
Yeah, we have what's called a four-cut stone. Yeah. So it's four-cut before rotation, 4 parallel lines before it moves around. Like you said, specifically for corn. And it said that when they're freshly sharpened, they're almost sharp enough to cut yourself on. All stones are from Quincy, Mass, and they're solid granite. So thick, sharp rock. And because it's not just, like you said, it's not just crushing the corn. It is also, these blades are shearing it. It's like a pair of scissors passing over the corn kernels, and it makes it smaller and smaller and smaller as it gets poured out to the end.
Now, the old mill was one of many mills that used to exist here on the island, correct?
Yeah, there were up to 5 windmills that were produced, 4 at any given time. There was never 5 at the same time. But this was the second windmill built here on Nantucket, and as anyone on the island can tell you, it's the last one standing.
And so when they were bidding on this, the old mill, were there any mills that were still existing at that time, or was this already the last stand of the mills?
At that point, this mill, the old mill, was called the old mill in part because it was the last one standing. Just 30 years earlier, though, there were actually 3 mills. So people who were at that auction would have known probably 3 mills in their lifetime. But at this point, it is the only one left. And that's part of the reason why there was this anxiety what was going to happen to it. Because by the end of the 19th century, the 1800s, there is a real connection to it. I mean, there have been endless reproductions of spoons and pictures and paintings and all sorts of memorabilia, souvenirs, pictures, and stereo views of this mill. And so it was seen as very much a staple of the Nantucket landscape as the last one still standing.
In the auction, was it just the Historical Association and one other bidding, or were there others?
So those were the 2 most motivated parties, but both of them were bidding on the mill to tap into this tourist market. At this point, hundreds of people a year were visiting the mill, and it was an important draw for tourists, and it had already become a beloved icon. The advertisement in the newspaper really tried to sell it as an economic investment. It said something along the lines of, and hundreds of tourists come to see the old mill who are willing to pay a small fee. So the auctioneer is trying to really get people to purchase the mill, calling upon this early version of Nantucket tourism. And the old mill was really at the center of it. There were dozens of depictions of it. And so it really was the first and most reproduced image of Nantucket that was sold to tourists.
I love me some good spoon memorabilia.
We have so many in our collection.
There are also a bunch of quilts and things in our current summer exhibition that show the mill.
I think it's probably the most used symbol of Nantucket. And in a large part because it really draws to this story of why Nantucket stands out as a place for tourists. It is open, it's the sea breeze that turns the windmill, it's pre-industrial. I think about 1880s when tourism's really taking off. Nantucket's open, there's no major industry, and that's really in stark contrast to the metropolitan hubs nearby, New York, Boston, smoky, smoggy, very industrial, and Nantucket's open. And the windmill is this agrarian, pre-American, right, 1746 is 3 decades before the Declaration of Independence, era of Nantucket. So it really starts creating this image of a Nantucket that is trapped in the sea of time.
I had a college professor who really emphasized that most literature at its core is about the return to the agrarian lifestyle. The mill proves that, I guess. I really disagreed with it, but here it is.
There you go.
Definitely this story of, it was simpler before, or in simpler times, which people have been saying since things were first written down. But this mill really speaks to this quote, this quote-unquote simpler time before whaling, before industry, before Nantucket's economic collapse, before tourism.
Yeah, I think this speaks to sort of a pastoral time on Nantucket. And people connect with that. I mean, I can actually say that I know for sure over the last couple of years, there have been more photographs taken of the old mill than of any other historic site that the Historical Association is a steward of. By a good margin, actually. I believe it's 2-1.
I believe that. Even within our collection, not from today, but historically, it's probably even more than that. If you sort our collection by our sites, the mill has so many more.
And there's a great painting that shows a number of mills sort of arrayed along the hill, Mill Hill, if you will. And so going back to what you were just saying is that by the time that the old mill was sold, all these other mills had been lost to time. So what exactly happened to all of these other mills?
They would all just fall victim to the real harsh environment of Nantucket. These are all built with the intention of being exposed to the wind, exposed to the elements, and it can be really brutal out here. That salty ocean breeze can really do a number to buildings. And over time, they just become worn down. And the working machines, the moving machines, they're constantly in motion and constantly doing damage to themselves just by virtue of being a machine. And they all become dilapidated. They all wear down. And I think in some ways to understand why all mills survive, I think I'm going to use an analogy of, a car. When it's a new car, a new mill, it's exciting. You take really good care of it. Even a single scratch on it drives you crazy. But give it 10, 15 years, it's a little bit older. You don't really care as much if you have all that Nantucket sand in the bottom of it. A little bit further, say it's 20, 25 years old, they're going to make a decision. Are you going to invest to repair it and the upkeep, or do you cut your losses and get a new one? But if you make it past this period, a car from the 70s, it's a classic. A car from the 1930s, 40s, historic, right? All the other mills, they become dilapidated, run down, and no one makes the investment to keep them. Our mill is the only one that made it past that period to become that 1970s classic car, right? And so once you make it past that initial investment, it becomes historic, then you can start tapping into that nostalgia. And I'm not immune to it. I'm lucky enough, I know Adam, you've been inside it too, but I'm lucky enough to be one of the people who helps run the mill. And when it is running, it is my favorite place to be on the island. It is incredible. The wind going, the corn dust flying everywhere. It is just, it's incredible. And it's so fun to be in control of this machine that is 280 years old. I'm so happy we saved it, but it is kind of just by virtue of making it over the hump from dilapidated to historic that we still hold on to it.
We have some great videos of you being in control of that machine.
Oh yeah, we do.
And I know that many other mills up and down the East Coast, either they didn't make it past that point of time where they become a classic car, in your metaphor. There are plenty of mills that used to exist on Cape Cod and other places in Massachusetts that just haven't survived because over the decades or hundreds of years that they may have been running, somebody had an accident, there was a flame, or some other disaster has befallen them. And so I guess that's the reason why the old mill here on Nantucket is the oldest standing working windmill in the United States.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's 6 windmills still standing on the Cape, including ours here at 7 on the Cape and Islands. A lot of them, again, going back to the other ones, weren't necessarily burned down or destroyed. Often they just fell into disuse. And that's mostly what happened with the ones out here. They just fell into disuse. But I will say, of the 4 that were taken down here, the most dramatic we've actually talked about. In our first episode about the Great Fire, we talk about how after the fire of 1836, they test gunpowder as a way to create fire breaks by blowing up buildings. Well, if you remember, the building that they test that theory with is Bunker Mill. It's one of the mills, one of the windmills here, and it was so unused that the best thing to use it for was testing gunpowder. So it's not so much that they burn down or blow up as much. This kind of an anomaly. More often than not, they just go into disrepair and people decide the material of it is better used doing other things, like taking a millstone and building a Civil War memorial. That's what happened here on Nantucket for one of them as well. Speaking
of reusing materials, I have heard the myth a lot from visitors that the old mill is built out of old ship parts. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I'm going to have to refer to our curator, Michael R. Harrison, and he says that there's not a single piece of wood in that structure currently that could have been used in a ship from the period.
Now, how exactly does the mill run?
Great question. So, one thing that not everyone knows, or thinks about, I should say, the wind can come from any direction. Right? This is an island. Traditionally, there was no trees or houses anywhere near the mill, and so the wind would swirl. And so the first thing you do when you run the mill, and we still do this today, is you take that big, long tail post that sticks out the back with a cartwheel on the back of it, and you have to rotate the entire roof of the building. It makes me so nervous when we do. It sounds like you're ripping the top off, but you are actually rotating the entire bonnet of the building, which has the sweeps or the blades on the front of it, so we can face directly into the wind. Once we face into the wind, we can rig up the sheets or the sails. We put them on the front. That allows those sweeps to catch the wind. That rotates an internal gear called the crown gear. It rotates vertically, which then rotates a rack and pinion horizontally called the bird cage. It looked like a bird cage. And then that rotates a grinding stone, which is a 3,800 pound stone in our mill. It's a huge mass of rock. And the wind is able to rotate it. And when you're looking at the mill from the outside, these big sheets, these big nostalgic, romanticized windmill blades are rotating so beautifully. While on the inside, that stone is rotating about 5 times as fast as those sweeps. And so that stone really gets moving. It gets moving quick. It's a lot of inertia, 3,800 pounds spinning 5 times faster than the sweeps outside. I will throw in one thing before we move on. And it's my favorite engineering part of the mill. And that's that the crown gear has 61 teeth, while the rack and pinion only has 12 pinions. And that seems bizarre, right? Because a 60-to-1 ratio would be exactly 5-to-1, which would make logical sense. That's what I would do. I like my whole round numbers. But by doing 61-to-12, it just throws off this ratio. But it's really clever because the mill is made completely of wood when it's constructed. Now we have a few metal parts to help support it. But it's entirely out of wood. And so if it was exactly 12 to 60, exactly 5-to-1, you would have the same 5 teeth hitting the same 1 pinion. And you'd create these very isolated spots of wear that were very consistent and create weak spots. By adding one more tooth, you make the math so much more complicated, but by adding one more tooth, you distribute that wear a lot more evenly. And it's just such a small little touch, but it's so clever. And there's so many little things like that in the mill. Each individual component is really simple. It's a big rock powered by simple machines and wind. Right? That's all it fundamentally is. But the way that it comes together is pretty incredible. It's like a huge Swiss watch, and each individual component is very simple, but altogether it becomes beautifully complicated, which also makes it tough to work on. But
how do we get parts for the mill now when we have to do repairs?
Oh, it's not always easy. We have some people on staff who can source some of the pieces, and there's some people on island that we work with. But for major work, like that big tail post you see out the back of the mill that allows us to rotate the bonnet, you need very specific type of wood and very specific knowledge to install it. And every major restoration that we've done, whether it's the 1930s or the 1980s, every single one of them bumps against this very same question, is where do we source all of this material and who does the repairs? And the issue every single time is, in a large part, how do you get these very unique pieces from a very unique skill set to this very isolated island 30 miles out to sea? And it is a big problem.
So when the Historical Association originally purchased this mill, they opened it and started running it as a tourist attraction. It was never seriously considered as still an economic machine, as far as I know. But what can you tell us about its time, not just in our care, but its time as sort of an icon of the tourist industry here on the island?
In the 1820s, a man named Jared Gardner actually purchased our mill as firewood, and he paid $20 because that's how much he thought the wood of the building was worth. But thankfully, instead of taking it apart as a wheelwright, he realized that the mill was actually in better condition than he thought and decided to repair it. And eventually the mill gets sold to the mill's most famous owner, John Francis Sylvia. And it is Sylvia who really turns the mill from this agricultural building that Gardner restored to the beloved tourist attraction. And by the end of the 1800s, he not only encouraged people to visit the mill, but saw himself as an authentic Nantucket character. He wore this iconic straw hat as he sold photos, stereo views, and postcards of the beloved structure. And when he passed away at the end of the century, he was almost synonymous with the mill itself in the eyes of most people.
Yeah, I guess it's. I mean, nowadays we would imagine that to be a little kitschy, but in some ways it sounds like he really did help the mill make that leap from being that dilapidated old structure to being a historic site that was worthy of purchase by the Historical Association.
He really was the leading face of changing it from this agricultural building to a tourist spot. He owned it for many, many years. Those many paintings that were done of him in the old mill, we have some of those in our collection, the photographs. He always had this big straw hat that he became pretty well known for.
You're talking about this person, John Francis Sylvia, who is taking the mill and trying to make it into more of a tourist attraction. But we've also been talking about the mill as a continuously running mill. So if you're selling it to non-millers and they're not necessarily using it just for its milling purposes, how do the milling practices and techniques get passed down too?
That's a really good question. Some things are passed down through tradition. Some things are passed down because it's known skills. I'm pretty sure he knew how to operate a mill successfully. But after him, it came to the NHA, and it's sat pretty quiet for a while. like anything, it's a skill that you have to use to attain. And as we shift in this current restoration, part of the question is making sure, are we operating it in the best way? And thinking about how the techniques that we use both reflect historic practices, but also the preservation of the machine. I think that John Francis Sylvia, you mentioned that a lot of these characters were very kitschy, but it's not kitschy because you're creating something as a stereotype. That's just who they were. John Francis Sylvia, he's selling himself, but he is an Azorean who is a miller. And I think he walks that line and definitely plays it up, but he is still a miller who I do think had a pretty deep knowledge of the mill and its structure and how it was operated.
Are there any instances of people running it really poorly that you know of?
I think there's certainly circumstances where maybe you have lost some of that knowledge being passed down from person to person. Maybe that the mill had a couple of years silent here or there. And some things are just lost to time. I mean, there's certainly aspects of the mill that we at the Historical Association don't necessarily know 100% if it was run this way or that way.
I think the building itself is a testament to the diversity of people who ran it. What I mean by that is that you have two schools of thought for historic buildings. You have the purist version of how it was when it was built, and then you have the practical version of the one that it is. I come back to this analogy of the car, right? When you get a new car, you run it properly. Do you oil change at X number of miles? You do everything to the T. Well, after a couple of years, maybe you have to whack it with a hammer to get going. That's not the correct way to do it. And I'm not saying we whack anything with hammers at the mill, but sometimes you do it the best that you know how. And I think that is part of the question of the knowledge over time, is understanding how the mill itself changes. You see all of that change in the building. You see the pieces that were there originally, the hand-hewn beams, and next to them, you see the beams that were cut with a saw. You can physically see the different changes over time of how technology has adapted to keep this machine operating.
And it's certainly changed, I think, with every renovation that's happened to the mill.
Knowledge during those renovations, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, even before the NHA took stewardship of the mill, I would say, you've just mentioned that at least two others did major renovations. Mr. Sylvia and oh God, what's his name with the $20 in the wood?
Oh, Jared Gardner.
Yeah. And so you would imagine that things changed during those restorations that they did, and certainly things have changed during the restorations that the Historical Association has done. You were mentioning the first major renovation that we did in the 1930s. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
In the 1930s, there was really an active attempt to make it a little bit more economically viable than it was. And so they repair it to a standard to run pretty aggressively. And by 1939, they milled 3,700 pounds of cornmeal, which is insane for a building that is nearly 200 years old. And it did real damage to the building. And they were constantly running it hard and the next year doing big repairs, and then running it hard and doing big repairs. But they really tried to make it so they could make money off of the old mill. And they milled a lot of corn, which would have been incredible to be in there to see. And they were selling it all over the place. And we have these receipts in our collection for, Junction City, for Buffalo, for Kansas City, for Waco, Texas, for Denver. So they were grinding the corn here and shipping it off. And so, again, we see this nostalgia. Why are you buying corn from a mill on Nantucket in Waco, Texas? Because you can. And because there's nostalgia to it, this cool factor to it.
3,700 pounds is a truly ridiculous number.
Yeah, I think my first summer we did maybe 100 or 200 pounds the entire summer. Yeah. Maybe 250.
Yeah. That sounds about right. I have never seen more than 10 pounds maybe in a day being milled at the old mill.
I will one up you and say that in that same year, they wrote to the administration, the millers wrote to the administration and said, if you let us run year round and you don't have these annoying tourists coming through, we can make 11,000 pounds of cornmeal.
Good Lord.
Which is the whole point of it, of running it, is to show how it functions. So them saying we don't want any of these tourists to come in and distract us. But can you imagine 11,000 pounds of this machine? Like that's just bonkers. And a machine that's so old.
It's a little bit of hubris, I think. I mean,
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
and I mean, did they end up damaging the mill doing this?
I just, again, like the story of anything, it just became economically unsustainable. And they were spending so much money year after year repairing the things that they were damaging. So, but I will say that because of this attempt to run it more commercially, there was an understanding of how the mill could be repaired. It did demonstrate the mill could be operated to some degree, and it did really start the precedent of the NHA being able to run it.
Was the corn still coming from Nantucket at that point?
At that point, no, it was not. We have the receipts of where it came from. I don't remember what it is exactly. And even today, they unfortunately thought that corn is just too expensive for us to...
As many of our listeners may know, the mill has been operating for the last couple decades. So what else was done to help bring it into the most modern era here on Nantucket?
The last major restoration that was done was in the 1980s. And there was a real big effort by the NHA to really address some of the wood that was weakening. So the foundation, structure, and mechanism were all assessed and repairs were done. One of the most passionate advocates for the mill during this period and later was John Gilbert, who was someone that I never had the privilege of knowing, but whose leadership I have heard a lot about, and whose legacy has been really formative to the mill. That work by John Gilbert and many others during the 70s and 80s really set the stage for the mill experience that folks have grown accustomed to today. And to the best of my knowledge, since then, it's been mostly operational up until the past year, when we are initiating another major restoration. And it's just tough to keep buildings in shape out here, especially when they're so exposed and when we continue to use them.
Like you said, it's like a car. It's tough to keep the rust off my car as well.
Yeah.
You've been listening to the Nantucket Gam. When we come back, we'll be joined by Amy Boyce, who's a preservationist, millwright, and founder of Husk Preservation. For now, just hang with us.
Welcome back. I'm joined now by Amy Boyce, one of the people who is actually currently helping us with the restoration right now. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get started, I want to ask a general question. Why do you think that people love mills so much? I mean, if you think about literature, Don Quixote, this classic and memorable scene of trying to fight the windmills, almost every painting of the American plains, you have these metal windmills. Even just any image of the Netherlands tends to invoke images of the windmill. So what do you think it is about these sweeping blades that invokes this romanticized image?
Yeah, I mean, I would have said that mills were so crucial to people having more time to do stuff. Like instead of pounding grain by hand, you have it done for you mechanically. But I don't think that's it. I think people are just moved by water wheels and sails turning, and you see that going way back in art, in carvings in stone and in oil paintings, and just there's something majestic about them that people are moved by. And when I've worked with watermill clients that have an actual water turbine, oftentimes they're really obsessed with getting a water wheel, even if it's not factual for the mill. So I think those are crucial elements that people just gravitate to.
I mean, you must have caught that bug a little bit because you originally got your BA in neuroscience, right?
You've done your research.
A little bit.
Yeah, I did, yeah. But I haven't ever done anything with it except for ponder more about it, I suppose. I don't know. I was just saying this morning to someone, I don't know where the mill bug started except for visiting historic sites with my family when I was little, because we didn't do any extravagant vacations. So we went to a lot of historic sites and blockade forts. But we did have a little water wheel at the Veterans Park in my downtown. And I feel like we may have had like a picnic near it or something. So maybe that did it. I don't know.
Well, before we started this conversation, you mentioned there's a little bit of controversy around your title of millwright because of when you start.
Yeah. I belong to a bunch of mill organizations, and one of them is the International Millenological Society. Is that right?
Is that a word?
Yeah,
what is
I think millenological. I think it was coined in like the 60s or 70s, but don't quote me on that. And they're like really serious. A lot of them are like academics that focus their lives on mills, and it's global. And they have a big conference every 4 years, and then another, like a smaller conference every 2 years, and people come from all over. And people get heated about the term millwright, even, and here too, because traditionally people started in the field when they were like pretty young, and they grew up doing it, and they learned from people who had been doing it their whole lives, and so on and so forth. So there was a huge amount of knowledge that now isn't really there. There's texts, and there's, like, I have a mentor, Jim Cricker, who's in his 70s, and he has done millwrighting most of his life. But sometimes I'm reluctant to use that as a term because I'm learning, every day on the job. So,
I mean, I think that brings up an interesting question because, as you mentioned, we make assumptions based on our knowledge. But do you think that changes the process of a restoration and how we repair and or replace parts of a mill? And for example, we may know a type of wood or design that works better for the machine that historic mills might not have.
That's a cool question. Well, one thing that I run into is that mills often attract a lot of retired engineers. And I totally get that because they
we are
see this
guilty of that as well.
Yeah, they love it. And I totally get why, because I love it. But, engineers, despite being super smart and having all of this experience throughout their life, sometimes they do try to implement solutions that end up actually being harmful. And I think that's sort of along the lines of what you're talking about, is applying modern knowledge to this past thing. And so we end up going to a lot of mills where people have altered things based on really good intentions and good knowledge and understanding of stuff, but it ends up being problematic because there is a subtle relationship to stuff. And I think that's where that comes in, that people that grew up working with the materials and they just have a more of an innate understanding of things. So, but I will say that, like, if the visual information remains in a place, so like you can go into a library and you see there's empty bookshelves, like, as long as there's visual information left in a historic building, it often informs the decisions you make and design decisions. So, like, a lot of the information is there. If you kind of listen with your eyes, you can learn a lot from actually, like, really just taking the time to take in what they did and why.
When you say preservation of a building, is there an intended goal for preservation? Are you settling this building in with the visual clues that you have? Are you trying to restore it to a certain point in time? Are you trying to make it usable? What is the goal of a preservation in the work that you do?
Yeah, well, it really depends on the client. So, there's an island, not Nantucket. There's a different island that has a windmill on it that's quite old, and they've had me out to look at it, and they don't want to run it. So their goal is taking care of this mill in a way that respects the mill's preservation. Doing proper purist preservation on the mill, but not going beyond that because they don't want to operate it. So their goal is to repair things that have decayed and doing it as it would have been done by the person who built this mill. So doing proper timber frame, scarfs, whatnot, using the proper in-kind materials, using the proper tools. So replicating how it was done. But they don't want to go beyond that. They're not going to restore their machinery. So that's the needs of that client. But on Nantucket Mill, I think your objective is that you'd like to resume grinding and demonstrations.
I can say 100%. I would love to do that.
Yeah,
I miss it.
Yeah, I think people do miss that. There's something just momentous to seeing a mill actually running. So
because
that
that's how we started this conversation, right? There is this kind of romantic notion of these sweeps rotating in the wind.
People are really moved by that when they go inside and they think, oh, this is going to be this loud building. And there's sort of this kind of comfortable creak that the building creates. As
I like
it's,
that.
Yeah, and it wants to be doing what it's doing. So for Nantucket, you want to be grinding. And, I can't speak to what the NHA wants to do at this point, but usually, I think that the whole operating lifespan of the mill is important to its preservation. So, like, you could say you want to, even though the mill might have been built in the 1740s, you could say we're not going to necessarily return it to the exact state it was in what we presume it was in 1740, because some of that information is lost. So we're doing some conjectural stuff there. And why is that more important than, something that was done in the late 1800s? So I think generally with mills, unlike maybe most house museums, the period of interpretation is actually the working life of the mill, and maybe even into early preservation efforts, because there weren't huge amounts of preservation efforts happening in the early 1900s.
I mean, there's a lot to unpack in that, which is a really interesting answer. But a couple of words stood out to me in the initial response, and that you said the word purist, and you want to replicate how the people who built it used the tools and material, and this in-kind material. But in some ways, as you just said, we can't necessarily do that, because the mill is an active machine that's constantly breaking, and not necessarily terrible breaks, but there are little things here that wear and tear over time. And so it sounds like you can't really do a purist restoration, because then you're not able to preserve the history of how it was repaired by people. That the history of the building is not a history of 1746, right? That there have been multiple people who have run it and who have done different repairs.
Yeah. And there's a lot of theories in preservation about whether you should make something very obviously new and so people can figure that out. And I think that's kind of some sort of like offensive. Like if you walk into a smoke blackened ceiling in a 15th century house and you see a new replacement board that's circular sawn and has fresh patina, that totally is going to disrupt your experience. And the whole point of this is so that this is still standing another 300 years from now. And the way that works is if somebody falls in love with it, and they're not going to fall in love with it if they have a disrupted experience. So a date stamp is totally what I'm into in that area, where you just a very discreet date stamp and you're good, but you have to really weigh the circumstances. It's different. It's going to be different in every building. So my preference would not be to integrate circular sawn timbers back into this building, but hewn timbers or up and down sawn for smaller members or things like that.
So I want to circle back from this kind of abstract concept of preservation and mills in general to Nantucket specifically.
Yeah.
How important were mills to early American economies like Nantucket?
On Long Island, I've worked on some mills that were built by the Dominy family, which is a multi-generational family that's really well documented. And their mill, this particular workmanship on the mills is extraordinary. Like it is just it's like dessert, like the most rich dessert you can imagine. And then you come to Nantucket, and it's like somebody was like, we need this machine working. We want to grind grain. We're going to get this done quick. But the joinery in there is beautiful. It's like they knew exactly what they were doing, but they weren't thinking about beauty. They were thinking about, we need a machine and we want it to do the job we want it to do. And that rawness of Nantucket is to its credit, like quite charming.
What gives that away as it being just a quickly built?
Just like rough hewing and not planing, not chamfering edges, having bark edge and sapwood in places that it doesn't actually matter because it's inside. But things like that, in carpentry, you start to realize that's not like good workmanship or whatever. But then, the person who built it demonstrates that they knew what they were doing. They had a plan. And because there's a lot of complicated joinery in there, you have an octagonal building that's canted or leaning inwards as it goes up. And you have multiple timbers coming into joints, not just one or two, but you have 4 or 5 things coming into one joint. And they had to figure out how to make that all work in that area. And they knew. So this person knew what they were doing, but they weren't taking any liberties to show off their skills. They were we're going to get this done and get it running. And I think that's quite charming.
Which is very on par for 18th century Nantucket. This is really before Nantucket's the dominant whaling capital, if I'm not mistaken. So it really fits the brand of just getting it done quickly and pragmatically rather than beautifully.
Yeah, pragmatic is the best word for that. It's very pragmatic, Mel. Yeah, it's everything in that it should be.
We are talking a lot of the work that's required to preserve mills in the modern context. How much work would the millers be doing, say in the 18th, 19th century as they're operating it? Would they be the ones doing a lot of the work? Would they have to hire specialized skill sets to do certain parts? Is it like a car where you have certain maintenance intervals that you do in terms of the stones, in terms of the wood, especially for grist mills like ours?
There's definitely a finesse to mill writing, and I think you can assume that a well-built mill was probably built by a millwright. in terms of like the day-to-day things, something breaks or whatever, a miller isn't going to be able to fix like a cast iron gear that breaks, but they're definitely going to be able to like replace a tooth in a gear, a wooden tooth in a gear. And they may even be able to go home and fabricate that tooth at home, you know, because they were probably multifaceted in their skill level. So I would say that is a widespread, you know, skill level of whether they were just able to grind grain or do much more.
It sounds like a millwright is a carpenter, an engineer, a little bit of everything has to come together to make a well-designed mill. So to wrap up this conversation, but why do you think it's important to continue to restore these mills? You know, these are not always easy projects to work on. They're not just structures. They are structures that then contain, you know, these huge moving parts of wood, and wood famously wears down at contact. Why is it important to continue to put in the effort to maintain these structures for people to view?
Yeah. Well, I would say that people who own mills should not run them unless they have someone who's truly trained and dedicated and not implementing their own ideas, but following like a precedent that's been established over centuries. That said, if you have people enter a mill that is operating, they're usually just taken aback by it and moved by it. And if you, like I said before, I've always felt that in order to cultivate people's desire to to support preservation, donate or do it themselves or whatever, you need to cultivate love. And that means somebody having a special experience at a place. And it is very special when you go into a mill and it's operating and you hear the sounds, and you might smell a little bit of corn dust in the air, and you know, it's just very sensory experience for people. And especially now that we're getting such extravagant tech, when you go into a place like that and you think, well, these are like the precursors to computers. And way back in terms of precursor, but this is all technology that brought us to the point that we're at today. And even though we feel disconnected from it, it's important to save because people do love it. And we need to cultivate that.
Well said.
Thanks.
To add to that point, my first summer on Nantucket, a lot of my time was spent learning how to operate our windmill here. And it was one of the most incredible summers of my life. I came home talking about it the entire year because there is something very emotional about operating this huge machine that's hundreds of years old in the same way that it would have been operated, and coming home from the end of the day covered in corn dust with the corn dust in your nose and hair and mouth. And it's just such a tactile experience running it. And it's something that a memory I don't think I'll ever forget. So I think that it is an incredibly well described way to talk about the love of these magnificent machines.
It gives me like little goosebumps. I love it. That's great.
Me too. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Thanks for having me.
For more information, head to nha.org or check out the show notes. This episode was developed and created by Thomas Parrish, Adam DeLogue, and Annalie Gilbert Keith. Special thanks to our Chief Curator, Michael R. Harrison, and our Director of Collections and Research Services, Amelia Holmes. Our theme music was composed and performed by Isaiah Williams. Other music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. The Nantucket Gam is a production of the Nantucket Historical Association. Thanks for listening.